Aisha al-Manubiya, also known by the honorific as-sayyida,
the mistress,
was a female Sufi saint born in between the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century to a rural but rich family living close to the town of al-Manuba outside of Tunis in modern-day Tunisia.
Hence the name al-Manubiya from Manuba.
Her father, who was a religious scholar, educated her in religion. She turned out to have an aptitude for Islamic studies and would spend serious effort and money in order to deepen her religious knowledge and living an as pious life as possible. To this end, she chose celibacy over married life and maternity, and dedicated her life to studying science, supporting women's rights, and spreading Sufi understandings of Islam. And she became a patron and student of various Sufi masters, such as Sidi Abu Sa'id al-Baji and Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili, important Sufi masters during this era, who have had many places named after them. As Aisha was moving back and forth between her rural home and urban Tunis and elsewhere, studying with various religious scholars trying to seek the path of God, she managed to create a following as a Sufi, where she would focus upon and help especially the poor and women, often the most marginalized in society and those that otherwise were seen as being people of ill repute, particularly unmarried women through divorce or widowed women and freed slaves. People that otherwise would not have had a chance were known to be helped by her and also taught by her, as she assumed the role of a Sufi teacher for them. Just like she had been given the ability to learn the inner meanings of Sufi teachings, she would give others the teachings and help others in their spiritual journey. In her own spiritual journey, she was known for her transgressive behavior, as she tried to interact with and imitate men in their roles of piety, where she acted like a man, with, for example, her breaking of the taboo of socialization between the sexes in Islam, with her praying alongside men in mosques, and she also refused to wear a veil. She treated the poor as rich and the rich as poor, including the Hafsid sultans who ruled the area, stating openly that she preferred the pious poor to the impious noble rulers, when asked to abandon her poor disciples in favor of working as a well-paid teacher in the court of the sultans. Furthermore, Aisha was known to have been calling for women's education and freedom, just like herself had been given the opportunity to become educated and rather free in her spiritual pursuits. And as-sayyida al-Manubiya was, in certain regards, though this is very debatable, a feminist ahead of her time. I say debatable because there are certain interpretations of her that view her as an early feminist, but there are a lot of contextuality and other interpretations that you could draw that would argue otherwise, and where you would argue that she was not as radical as later history has made her out to be. What is known about her is that she followed Al-Muta'abbidat, or at the very least something very similar to it. The Al-Muta'abbidat and their descendant Sufi lines have a focus in the values of self-blame, that piety should be a private matter, and that being held in good esteem due to virtuous behavior, rather than practicing pious behavior for its own sake, would lead to worldly attachment and thus away from the closeness to God. In this view, transgressive behavior, such as acting like a man and not showing non-Islamically mandated respect and not following various social mandates, was thus a way to strengthen the faith by sacrificing public virtue for private piety and closeness to God. Though when it comes to the practices associated with al-Muta'abbidat, Aisha still stands out in the way that rather than being a Sufi that tried to avoid social interactions, as was the case in many Muta'abbidat interpretations, she actively interacted with and sought out to help the most poor and exposed in society by performing good deeds, focusing her piety upon others as a way to get closer to God. She did charity and worked with men that she was not married to in order to seek greater Islamic knowledge and to help the poor and others regardless of social norms or expectations, as this was deemed more important than any sort of modesty. Public modesty and public compliance with the rules of society was discarded in favor of her private jihad, her struggle on God's chosen path. A path she had started to walk upon since childhood, and from an early age she was known to challenge social norms and perform miraculous deeds, such as bringing animals back to life and sharing food that never ran out, and the like. Though, let me reiterate that how challenging her deeds and her sainthood was to the norms of society at that time is very much up for debate. Safwan Masri states that she is
Considered an early Islamic feminist and one of the few females to have been granted the title of saint.
Though there are other important leaders and Sufis that have been women throughout Arabic Islamic history. Look at early videos that I've made. And through various criteria, a woman could actually achieve pretty high status in Arabic Islamic society in pre-modern times. Islamic education for women, though very rare in a period and place where even most men remained uneducated in any matter, was not unheard of. Not in Islamic Arabic history generally, or even in the area and period where she was active. The Tunisian historian Abdesattar Amamo states she wasn't the only one in the capital. There are others, like Lala Arbia, Saida Ayula or Saida Miska, but she imposed herself through her personality and good deeds. Furthermore, Malamatiya Sufism was during this time and in this area not that rare, and was a common current of Sufi thinking during this period and context. Hence, she being a radical Malamatiya practitioner of Sufism is not that out of the ordinary when you look at it in that way. Though it should be granted that whereas it is often customary for Muslim female Sufi saints to be recluses, compare with, for example, the earlier saint Rabia al-Adawi, Aisha mixed with common society, even male society, and her Sufism focused upon being in society, performing good deeds, rather than distancing yourself in solitude in order to reach God. Her view being لِلْأَلَاهِ أَحَبُّ الْكَرَمَاتِ لِلْغَيْرِ. For God, the most loved of the acts of grace are for the other. Charity and piousness have historically been very closely linked in Islamic traditions. And Aisha was a very pious Muslim that became remembered for the lengths she would go to in order to aid others in giving food and teaching poor people, both men and women, the ways of God. A Shadili, founder of the Shadili Sufi tradition, and one of her supposed teachers, also taught that you should try to integrate Sufi practices in your normal life and not distance yourself from normal life and normal society, a view that probably influenced Aisha al-Manubiya to be more interactive with greater society and not to try to live like an hermit reclusively away from society. Though her reaction on most social conventions probably stem from other Sufi traditions that were not that uncommon in her place and era. It is also important to know that she was not considered too transgressive for society, as she became famous for her life and dedication to her interactive social Sufism and declared a saint, and became honored after her death, showing that her behavior, at least in some way, was not unpalatable enough to prevent her from being praised during her time and afterwards, as her legacy still remains rather large, as she has a great market square in Tunis named after her and two very important shrines dedicated to her, in al-Manuba and the other in the Gorjani district of Tunis that have been sites of several pilgrimages through the ages. It was, for example, customary in the 19th and early 20th centuries for the rulers of Tunis to make a yearly ritual circuit of the great shrines of Tunisia, around and especially on the 27th day of Ramadan, and thus they often visited these shrines that were dedicated to Aisha, as-sayyida, al-Manubiya. However, in more recent time,
on the 16th of October 2012, her shrine was vandalized in an arson attack. And this was done by a group of at least 6 radical Islamists who stormed the premises and with threats with non-firearm weapons also robbed the shrine and the people there.
Some context for this. Aisha al-Manubiya is considered a feminist symbol of social justice by certain people. Though again, she did arguably play to various other expectations where she lived, she was later interpreted in modern times as being a feminist women rights activist in older times. And these sort of modern progressive politics that is associated with her, here being seen as a figure of female empowerment and female Sufi Islamic piety that acts independently of the will of the men around her, probably clashed with various Islamist interpretations of how society should be run and how Islam should be followed, and thus motivated this attack on her shrine. Also, as a Sufi saint, she and her shrine were a target too, as certain interpretations of Islam reject Sufism and the saint traditions connected to Sufism, seeing them as being against Islam, accusing the idea of Sufi sainthood as being against the teachings of true Islam, and seeing her legacy as a threat against the true interpretation of Islam in this sort of interpretation of Islam. It should also be noticed here that this is a modern conflict or clash of religious political ideas that resulted in the desecration of this shrine, as the shrine had not been targeted before, even if she was in certain ways controversial in the medieval period. None during that period and later targeted her shrines until modern times. And this shows the complexity in gender roles and religious practices, and that controversies today might be stronger than they were in the past, and might result in actions that were not taken in the past. However, her shrine has since been renovated and has reopened to the public. It is staffed by women and is particularly popular with female visitors, as again, Aisha al-Manubiya has become a symbol of female Sufi piety. And that was Aisha al-Manubiya, the famous female Sufi saint. If you want to know about another famous female Sufi saint, I recommend watching the link about Rkia al-Adawi. And also my viewers always know that I'm open for comments, questions and likes. I really appreciate these things from you. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.